This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. In the chapter in Marx's Capital that deals with the working day, Marx makes a very interesting observation, actually in the form of a question. He asks this. He says, how is it that a state controlled by capital and the landlords will pass legislation which will restrict the length of the working day in such a way as to try to redound to the benefit of labour? We have, in a sense, an analogous situation right now. When we ask the question of why would Treasury secretaries in the United States government, many of whom have come from Goldman Sachs backgrounds, really care about passing legislation to help homeowners or healthcare or education or anything of that kind? And the short answer is, of course, they don't. And I think that the short answer in Britain at the time when the struggle over the daily wage, the working day, when that struggle was in motion, the capitalist class, by and large, and the capitalist individuals didn't care at all about that kind of legislation. But Marx then points out that there is a kind of real issue here, which arises out of a term that I've often used in these commentaries. It arises out of the coercive laws of competition. That if I'm competing with you and I can employ my workers for 12 hours in a day and you can only employ yours for 10, I'm likely to get a higher rate of profit, and I'm forcing prices down, and therefore at a certain point you're going to be pushed to also go for a 12-hour day. Now, the result of this is if you can go from 12 hours to 13-hour day to 14-hour day, the coercive laws of competition know no limit. And at a certain point, we find that you're working workers to a point where they die. And I've mentioned this topic before, which is death by overwork. And this is something which occurs in China these days. It's something that occurs in Japan. It is something which has occurred in the advanced capitalist countries. And in addition to which, it turns out that if you lengthen the working day from 10 to 12 hours, the last 2 hours do not produce the profit as was held in the 19th century. What they do is they actually weaken the concentration of the labor and the efficiency of the labor. So there is a kind of declining efficiency that goes on with the length of the working day, to the point where if you go to 14 hours in a day, your laborers are falling asleep on the job, and there are industrial accidents, there are all kinds of things going wrong. So there is, if you like, a social need to control the length of the working day effectively. And this is what Marx starts to talk about, that it is a situation in which individual capitalists operating in their own self-interest are likely to behave in a way which is inimical to the conditions which are best suited to reproduce the benefits of working of the capitalist class in general. So this problem is one which is very, 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 very general. And it leads then to the kind of question of why it is that that we should start to think about the conditions of capital accumulation in relationship to wage labour in a very distinctive way. So if we sit back and ask the question, what sort of labour does capital demand? What kind of labour does it need? And what kind of labour is it going to look for when it goes into the labour market to try to fill a position? And the answer is this, I think. The capitalist would prefer to have laborers who are healthy, who are physically fit, who are mentally capable of adjusting to certain labor regimes, who are collaborative and respond to instructions, can work with instructions, can take limited initiative in relationship to labor processes to be able to sort things out when they go wrong. In other words, you could list a set of qualities that are very, very positive for capital, and which capital would like. In other words, if you look at it from a class perspective, and you said, what kind of class character would you like labor to have, then it would be all of those things mixed in with cultural kind of dispositions which are favorable to engaging in the labor process, knowledge and intelligence and so on. And therefore, it is in the interest of capital, in general, though not necessarily in the interest of individual capitalists, it's the interest of capital in general for a labor force to be constructed which has all of those characteristics. Now, clearly, those characteristics are not fixed. They depend very much on the technological mix. They depend very much on the nature of the labor process. And they depend, therefore, on some kind of match which goes on between labor capacities and powers on the one hand and capitalist needs on the other hand. An interesting example of this was written up in a book by Edmund Wilson some time back, which is called Apologists to Iroquois. And what Wilson found was a rather surprising situation in which the Mohawk Indians, indigenous population, seemed to have a capacity to walk around at great heights without any trouble. And for that reason, the Mohawk Indian labor force became absolutely critical for the building of skyscrapers in places like New York and Pittsburgh, because they could be up there on the girders walking around fearlessly. Whereas everybody else, I mean, if you put me up there, I'd have vertigo and so be clinging on for dear life, but they just walk around. So here you have a cultural group and an indigenous group, which has certain, for some reason, physical cultural skills which enable it to engage in a certain kind of labor process in ways which most people would not be able to do. And so M.M. Wilson wrote this wonderful book, Apologies to them, that is not understanding that here is an indigenous group that has played a very, very critical role in the building of the skyscrapers of New York and Pittsburgh and beyond, and that therefore that group should be appreciated and rewarded. And I mean, he was making these kinds of very general points in this book. But this is the sort of thing I mean when I sort of talk about this matching of cultural attributes and labor demand, and how particular they can be in particular circumstances. But there is, therefore, in a capitalist social formation, the requirement that things be organized in such a way that you end up with the kind of working class which is useful and has all of the attributes which you would require for capital in a given state. Now, in the 1960s, again, if I go back to that, it's because in some ways we're talking about a period of Fordism, a period which created, as Gramsci called it, the American worker, the new worker, the Fordist worker, who had certain attributes, and those attributes were not only acquired on the job, they were also acquired by having an educational system, a healthcare system, a housing system, and all the rest of it in such a way as to be able to make the reproduction of those kinds of workers okay and feasible and financially viable, so that there they were available for employment in the car plants. So this, but then of course the car plants started to change their technology, and you had less and less demand for that kind of labor. So you don't need that labor anymore. You need a different kind of labor. So one of the big questions right now is, what is the demand for labor in capital right now? What is the class demand? And what you see is an interesting kind of response to that, because it depends where you are in the world. If you're in China or if you're in Bangladesh, the kind of demand coming from capital is for a certain sort of labor, which would not be available, easily available in the United States. In the United States, the demand for labor is very different, but there's a demand for labor which is less and less voluminous and more concerned with the capacities of labor to engage in research, to engage in mental capacities and mental work and the like. So that the conditions then of investment in a labor force are going to look very, very different depending upon the kind of labor process which is going to be dominant in the particular place and time where capital is operating. Now, if we start to look at this from a global perspective, we're finding that, in fact, we don't want to see the reproduction of a labor force. We want to see the reproduction of labor forces. Labor forces which have very different capacities and powers in different places. In the United States right now, the demand for casual labor, yes, it's there, but casual labor is not the same as industrial labor. And the demand for employment in manufacturing, in the classical sense of manufacturing, is very much reduced in the United States. But the demand for other kinds of labor has expanded dramatically, so that we see, for example, employment in Amazon, employment in Starbucks, employment as delivery workers, employment in airports, and so on. All of those sources of employment are actually pointing to a demand for a certain kind of labor force, which is able and willing. The willingness becomes important, because a labor force that is operating under conditions of coercion rarely operates as efficiently as a labor force which operates under the rule of consent. So that consent to the manufacturing process, consent to the labor process becomes very, very, very significant in terms of the kind of labor force we want. Now, this then kind of raises the question: how well are we doing in terms of educating people, housing people, looking after their healthcare needs and mental capacities and powers and cultural predilections and so on? How good are we at mobilizing all of those elements together to create a labor force which is adequate to capital in a particular place and time, given its technological mix and given its demands for knowledge and understanding and capacities and certain capacities and powers? How good are we at doing that? The answer is we're not that good. But the fact that we're not that good in a particular place is modified by the fact that we can always find labor from elsewhere. And here I have to say, the United States has been pretty parasitic on other countries in terms of getting the kind of labor force it really needs and requires, given the kinds of job opportunities that exist in the United States. Actually, there is underinvestment in the United States in education, underinvestment in training, and underinvestment even these days in terms of university and higher education. So that the kind of the underinvestment there means that the actual domestic product, in terms of the kind of labor force you need to work on the one hand in Google's research arm, and on the other hand in terms of the delivery workers for Amazon, the kind of the organization of the production of labor is not fitting very well with those requirements. So one of the things that happens is that when you have a deficit of a certain kind and a scarcity of some kind, you go around the world and say, where can we find a labor force which will meet our needs? Now, it's interesting that by and large, if you go into any hospital in New York City and you look at who the doctors are, how many of them are immigrants? How many of them, where did they come from? Well, they came from Egypt, they came from Africa, they came from all over. That is, the United States offers certain employment opportunities and allows for the migration of those populations into the United States because they're technically skilled. So that my guess is that the healthcare system in the United States operates very heavily on the basis of imported labor, and the kind of imported labor which is very specifically equipped to work in hospitals. My experience of New York hospitals is that it was very hard for me to see somebody who looked like they were kind of straight up from the United States. They were from all over the world, and even from countries like Burkina Faso and so on, which you would think would not be a good source, but they're a good source because in their own countries the labor opportunities are very weak. So if you kind of said, look, if you are a skilled physician and you're living and working in Puerto Rico at some point or other, you might want to think about moving to the United States, where the job opportunities are much better, the facilities are much better. The same would be true of a doctor with certain skills from in Cairo or sort of quantum computer specialists who were located in Britain but find themselves lured to Silicon Valley because that's where the action is and that's where all the opportunities are. So the United States increasingly looks to recruit a labor force from overseas, and in doing so is, I think, in a sense, becoming parasitic upon the labor forces coming from elsewhere. It's well known, for example, that software workers come from southern India, from Bangalore, and if you go to Google, you're going to find a whole labor force which is sort of South Asian labor force. In certain technical areas like space economics, you'll find a lot of technical workers coming from Russia, particularly after the collapse of the Cold War. So the question of labor force preparation for the dynamics of capital accumulation is something that needs to be looked at as a kind of almost policy issue. And that policy issue is taken care of by certain departments, or should be taken care of in certain departments of the federal government, but also in certain departments of state governments and the like. But the assessment of how adequate that preparation is for a labor process that is very much in transformation through artificial intelligence, for robotization and mechanization, the introduction of electronics, and the emergence of new demands. For example, delivery workers and Uber workers and people like that. So this dynamic, this dialectic, if you like, between supply of labor and demand for labor is one which is creating a certain amount of problem in society. In particular, one of the things we're finding is more and more labor is actually becoming redundant and is becoming no longer necessary. And here we have a situation, a really remarkable situation, where the surpluses of labor looking for productive work and looking for things to do given their capacities and powers, the surpluses are becoming extremely significant in relationship to the fact that there are surpluses of capital around also. So one of the big issues, I would argue right now, is taking the surpluses of labor that exist and the surpluses of capital that are lying around out there and which are not being used very productively. They're largely being used for unproductive uses, trying to find ways to bring the surpluses of capital and the surpluses of labor together in social projects, which are really oriented towards the creation of a different kind of environment, an environment that is going to be adequate to the needs of everybody, instead of adequate simply to the needs of the current ruling oligarchy. Here's then the situation that capital is right now, in a sense, dominated by an oligarchy that has no interest, and a financial oligarchy also, which has no interest in this big question of the relationship of the labor force as it is evolving and the creation of productive work for a social purpose. They have no interest in that. So we've got a ruling class. When I asked that original question, why would the a ruling class of the state, which is made up of capitalists and landowners, actually pass legislation over the length of the working day? Well, that needs to be answered coherently. And right now, the big problem, it seems to me, is that there is no forethought being given, even within the capitalist class, to try to take these surpluses of capital and surpluses of labor and put them together in useful tasks. And this, of course, is always the hallmark of crisis. That is, in the 1930s, if you go back, you would find masses of capital lying around unused. You would find masses of labor around unused. And the big problem was the inability of having a kind of society, a capitalist society, and a capitalist ruling class that was prepared to somehow or other bring these back together, which is what Roosevelt was trying to do via the New Deal. And to some degree, there was some partial success in the New Deal, but essentially there was the changes that occurred through World War II and through the 1940s and 1950s, which actually got us to the situation of full employment of capital and labor once more. So the employment of capital and labor being put to those socially useful tasks. Now, my own belief is that there is so much surplus capital out there, so much surplus labor out there, that if they are put together to try to create socially useful effects in terms of, healthcare, built environment, all the rest of it, that in effect the surplus would still be there. Now, the surplus can go two ways. The surplus can either go to capital and to the oligarchy, and the oligarchy will, like the famous example of the vampire squid of Goldman Sachs with tentacles down into bloodsuckers down into the depths of society. It's either going to go to be sucked up by the oligarchy, or it's somehow going to be retained, but retained in such a way that would create a society where basic needs are met, because we've taken all of that surplus capital and surplus labor and put it together so basic needs are met. Once basic needs are met, then actually we have free time to do what we like, and actually we create a situation where the surplus time can either be taken up for production for the oligarchy, or it can be taken up for people to having free time. And this, it seems to me, what the socialist project should be about. It's about the production of conditions where we maximize the free time that people have. This is something that Terry Eagleton made a lot of in his book on why Marx was right. That, in fact, the two things he kind of said. The Marxist project is to create a world in which basic needs are met, in which they're met in such a minimum of time that thereafter people can do what they like. And they can do productive things or unproductive things. But what we have to do is to stop the blood-sucking vampires of Goldman Sachs and all the rest of it, sucking out the surplus time in ways which are advantageous to them. Now, that means that there has to be control, clearly a control of the oligarchy, and we're seeing how the oligarchy is trying to exercise its own control. It controls as much as it can over the sphere it works in, but also uses on the side. For instance, Jeff Bezos buys the Washington Post, and while he has not at this point sort of intervened, as far as I know, dramatically in terms of the content of the newspaper, nevertheless, the fact that it is controlled by Jeff Bezos of Amazon plays, I think, a significant role. We just find out right now that Elon Musk is trying to take over Twitter and again control the media. So control of the media is again a serious issue. So what seems to me to be useful at this point is to really try to re-theorize the nature of the capitalist state and to understand that the capitalist state is not a monolithic entity. One part of it, like the Treasury Department in particular, is aligned almost totally with the need to reproduce capital in an orderly way. And that is what the mission of the Treasury Department is. The other departments of housing, healthcare, education, and so on are about trying to create a working class which is adequate to capital. But we have to actually transform that away from adequate to capital to creating a working class which is able to use its surplus, its condition of surplus to requirements in such a way that it mops up the surplus capital in projects which are going to create a world in which basic needs are going to be met by capital and labor working together as they are right now, and eventually abolishing the class distinction in a situation where automated automated possibilities are taken care of. Basic needs are followed up and met. And like I say, the rest of the time is totally free time for people to do whatever they want, presumably in such a responsible way that by doing what they want, they don't interfere with the rights and well-being of other people, which is always one of the problems that needs to be sorted out.
Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.